You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
The Vietnam War holds a special place within Australian, and in particular Australian military culture. If you haven't seen the movie The Odd Angry Shot, 1, you're not really the listener I'm looking for, and 2, you need to get out and see it. Graham Kennedy, the king of television. G'day listeners, it's Mick, your host here. I am at the Australian War Memorial again because 1, they keep letting me in the door, and 2, I don't really have anywhere else to go because no one else lets me in the door. But I've decided to look into the Australian experience in Vietnam, and I'm lucky enough to have found a guest who knows all about that. My guest today is Dr. Tom Richardson. Tom completed his doctorate, as if we'd never really been there, Pacification in Phuoc Tuy province, Republic of Vietnam, 1966 to 1972, at the University of New South Wales in 2014. Prior to this, he attended Monash University, receiving a first-class honours degree in 2009. His research interests include Australian military history, the Vietnam War, and counter-insurgency. Before joining the official history team here at the Australian War Memorial, Dr. Richardson worked as an associate lecturer in history at my alma mater, the University of New South Wales, Canberra. He's also one of the people to speak to on operations in Phuoc Tuy province. And I do know that a lot of you have asked me, who is the guy to speak to on Australian operations in Phuoc Tuy province? So I'm now speaking to him. Look, Tom, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Mick. I'm a big fan, so it's very exciting to be here. And you know, I can reveal just on the side that I control the official history's Twitter account.
Ah, brilliant.
And in that role, I was flicking through looking for photos to put up on it, and I encountered some pictures of a very suave young Australian artillery officer in Helmand province. And nice to see that, you know, you've kept that look.
Yes, well, the hair never goes away. Unfortunately for my father it did, but I think I've got the genes on the mother's side of the family. I'm assuming I'm the suave artillery officer because the other one was a redhead. Now, Tom, before we get amongst the rubber plantations of Phuoc Tuy, now, I'm not really sure if they have rubber plantations there, but that's my understanding. Are you able to tell our listeners a little bit about what got you interested in history as a profession, and in particular, the Australian involvement in the Vietnam War?
I've been interested in history since I was a little kid, which has been embarrassing to say, and I'd sort of already resolved I wanted to be a historian by the time I did my undergrad at Monash. And while I was there, I did a course on the Vietnam War, and I was sort of struck by how a lot of the writing on Vietnam focuses on a couple of very narrow topics, particularly the question of how the United States gets involved sort of between 1960 and 1965. And that within the Australian field, a lot was written about a handful of certain battles, particularly Long Tan, but also Coral Balmoral. Mm-hmm. And not a lot had been written about counter-insurgency. So I kind of had that in the back of my mind. I actually came up here to Canberra at the start of 2010 as a summer scholar here at the War Memorial. And that was when Ashley Eakins was finishing off the final volume of the Australian Official History of Vietnam, Fighting to the Finish.
Yep.
I then read an article called The Red Queen's Race about pacification in Binh Dinh province in 1969-70 in the Journal of Military History, and I sort of thought, oh man, I should totally do this for Phuoc Tuy. And so I ran that idea past Ashley, and he said, yeah, that's a real good idea, you should talk to this guy at ADFA called Dr. Bob Hall. So I did that, and he said, yeah, you should get on board as a PhD student. So I moved up to Canberra the next year and did the PhD.
Brilliant. A good reason to come to Canberra aside from the lovely weather we have here.
That's right.
Now, are you able to tell us a little bit more about Phuoc Tuy's prominence in the Australian involvement in Vietnam?
So Phuoc Tuy doesn't exist anymore. It's roughly analogous to the modern province of Ba Ria Vung Tau in the modern Socialist Republic of Vietnam. So it's sort of Phuoc Tuy as a province was important because it controlled the access between Vung Tau, which at the time was South Vietnam's second biggest port, and Saigon, which was obviously the capital city and the biggest port. The Australians are based there. First Australian Task Force from 1966 is based there until the end of 1971. At Nui Dat, a name I'm sure a lot of listeners are familiar with.
Yeah.
Phuoc Tuy, it's an interesting relationship in that the Australians never have a formal responsibility for Phuoc Tuy as a province. It's just that their AO largely coincides with its boundaries, although that it sort of contracts and expands over the course of the war depending on the force levels the Australians had available, which did fluctuate. But basically, there was a perception, unofficially, Phuoc Tuy was Australia's province. And so not only did most Australian combat operations occur in Phuoc Tuy, various nation-building efforts that were sort of a bit ad hoc through the course of the war, depending on the initiative of local commanders, they also took place. So I guess, yeah, not only do a lot of the famous engagements that the Australians fight, again, obviously Long Tan, but also, say, Bin Ba for the 5-7 RAR guys that out there, the battalion, they all happen in Phuoc Tuy, so it's got a legacy like that. But we also impact the geography of the place, for want of a better term.
Yep. Okay. So it is, from an Australian point of view, it was our backyard while we were over there.
Yeah, that's how we felt, even though the upper echelons of Australian Command were often quick to sort of point out that legally or technically that wasn't true.
Yeah, okay. One of those tricky situations where your boundaries don't necessarily always match up with the area you need to affect to achieve your mission, which I'm sure that's been resolved and there hasn't been any issues about that since the end of Vietnam.
No, I've heard we learnt all the lessons of Vietnam really well in that respect.
Excellent. Now, these operations were, of course, part of a much larger and wider pacification program during the Vietnam War. Are you able to tell us a bit of a context as to where Australia fit in the pacification?
Yeah, so I guess probably the first place to start is how we actually define pacification. Yep. It's pretty interesting in that when you talk to a lot of Australian veterans, they have a pretty narrow view of what pacification was. They would see it in terms that we would probably define today as population-centric counter-insurgency, so security of villages and population centres, and then attempts to win the hearts and minds, to use that sort of age-old cliche.
Yeah.
But winning hearts and minds through quite limited means, so civic action projects like digging wells, or infamously in Phuoc Tuy we try and build windmills, and they don't really work that well.
Yeah.
For a variety of reasons, distributing stuff to children, building marketplaces, all that kind of stuff. So that's how a lot of Australian veterans see pacification. In the book, I argue pacification actually had a much wider remit. Americans particularly, but some Australians, essentially saw pacification not just as a really narrow effort to defeat this insurgency, but part of a broader project to change the nature of Asia. Mm-hmm. In Vietnam in this particular instance, but part of this broader project in Asia, where coming out of the Second World War, Asia is seen as sort of this backward place full of rural peasantry.
Yep.
And there's this fear that communism will appeal to these people and we will lose this huge chunk of the world's population to communism. So it's a sort of crucial battleground in the Cold War. So the desire is to bring those people on our side by changing the nature of their lifestyle.
Yep, okay.
Now, how you go about that was never really agreed upon, and so there's a sort of, depending on who you ask and at what time period, there were various visions of that. The title of the book itself, Destroy and Build, comes from a quote from Lyndon Johnson, who obviously was the President of the United States. In early 1966, he pulls in one of his national security staff, a guy called Robert Comer, and says, Bob, I want you to go and run the other war in Vietnam. And Comer says, I wasn't aware there were two, Mr. President. And Johnson goes, well, I want a war to build as well as to destroy.
Yeah.
And I want a war that will help the farmers in particular of South Vietnam. You've got to remember, Johnson, as a politician, had made his career through Roosevelt's New Deal, through stuff like bringing electricity to his Texas constituency, stuff like the Tennessee Valley Authority that really increased the living standards of people in the American South. He wanted to apply that vision, and a lot of people in his administration wanted to apply that kind of vision to South Vietnam. And so they even talked about essentially damming the Mekong and doing a Tennessee Valley Authority on the Mekong River. So pacification sort of had this grander idea of we're going to change how these people live.
Yeah.
Sitting alongside that is the Australian experience in Malaya, where we fought a kind of classic counter-insurgency. As I'm sure a lot of your listeners would be aware, Malaya is often held up as a sort of example of a really successful counter-insurgency campaign, but then the counter-narrative is, well, it was successful because of a range of factors.
Yeah, if you want to use brutality as a method, it's quite...
Yeah, if you want to round people up and shove them in camps.
In camps and offer prices for people's heads, not necessarily the rest of their bodies.
Yeah, I guess sort of the intersection of those two visions, you could say, comes at a place called Ap Sui Ne.
Yep.
In mid-1967, the Australians round up a large number of Vietnamese. They were Vietnamese, but they were ethnic Montagnards, so not ethnic Vietnamese,
yep.
who were living in very small settlements around the fringes of a major Viet Cong base area,
yeah.
In an area called Slope 30. And they round them up and they go, we're going to build you a new village. It's going to be great. You can live there. It'll be away from this base area. We can secure it. So again, sort of shades of Malaya. But also, we're going to show you how good life in a sort of Western-style society can be.
Yeah.
And again, that sort of goes to this idea of we will show you the benefits of our way of living, and the prosperity that can bring, and as a result, you will come to us and you'll reject communism.
A little bit of cultural imperialism.
Yeah, it's really noticeable. A historian called John Murphy makes the point. You look at the shots of Ap Sui Ne as it's being built in early September 1967, and it looks like a sort of new housing subdivision, like a post-war housing subdivision. It's all like orderly rows and right angles and stuff, which is a total contrast to your normal Vietnamese village. Ap Sui Ne translates as the hamlet of sweet water.
Yep.
What would you like to guess was the problem with Ap Sui Ne?
I'm guessing they didn't have much water.
There was no water, so there's sort of practical problems on that level that always dog the hamlet.
Only fate could be so cruel with the naming.
That's right. It's off a main road, so it's hard for the villagers to sort of engage in trade with the rest of the province.
Yeah.
More broadly, I found a really interesting report in 1968. A bunch of Australian civil affairs personnel go out to the hamlet, and they observe people sort of living happily enough. It's a pretty poor place, but they're welcomed in. But like pigs are living in the houses and stuff like that. And they're sort of really concerned by hygiene. But they make the point in the report: the villagers know that it's bad hygiene for the pigs to live in the house, and that they should be washing their hands before they eat and stuff. Yeah. But they just choose not to do that because that's not the way they're used to doing things. Yeah. So it's almost this conscious rejection of these Western models and this assumption that, these people, once we show them the light, they will come to us. It didn't often prove to be the case. So I guess pacification, the Australians sit in it in a sort of uneasy way. Yeah. We've got our own ideas of how you fight a counter-insurgency war. Some of them coincide with the way the Americans do, others don't. I guess the other big one is operational. Yep. In military tactics. I think, again, a point I make in the book is while we do have all this experience in Malaya, there is still significant disagreement within the Australian Army on how you fight a counter-insurgency, or how you fight a counter-insurgency in Phuoc Tuy and the proper role of 1st Australian Task Force in doing that. Again, a good example, and it feeds into the wider debate, again, which I'm sure your listeners are pretty aware of, between Westmoreland and Abrams. Mm-hmm. Do you fight big units, or do you do population centric counterinsurgency?
Did they really fight too differently, or did they just sell it differently?
Well, that's exactly it. In mid-1969, Brigadier Pearson decides he's going to do a bit of population centric counterinsurgency at a place near a big town called Dat Do in the district of Dat Do. Essentially what he decides to do is cordon off a bunch of villages, the largest of which is Dat Do, from a Viet Cong base area in the Long High Hills. Yeah. Now the Australians have previously tried to go into the Long High Hills, they've taken a lot of casualties. Pearson says, I don't want any of that. Rather than go into this rabbit warren of sort of tunnels and caves and so on, let's just create a cordon and cut the Viet Cong off from their supplies. That works well, except we keep taking casualties on a minefield that we'd laid in 1967. That's sort of another story. Mm-hmm. But nonetheless, the overall approach is working. And by sort of late August 1969, the Viet Cong are saying, we're really in trouble here. We're feeling the pinch. We can't get supplies. We can't get into these population centres. At that point, a guy called Julian Ewell, who is the American, essentially Corps Commander equivalent of 2 Field Force Vietnam under General Abrams, he tells Pearson to stop it. 1 ATF is not killing enough Viet Cong for Ewell's liking. He's a total believer in body count, and his whole way of measuring stuff.
Search and destroy.
Yeah, it's like we have to kill this many people a month, and if we're not killing that many, we're doing something wrong. But if we do kill that many, then that's going to be more than the infiltration rates, and that's how we're eventually going to win the war.
Secretary McNamara will be happier with that.
Yeah, but this all happened under Abrams' watch. So again, this sort of distinction between Westmoreland and Abrams is maybe a bit false.
Yeah.
But also even within the Australian Army, Pearson's successor Weir, Brigadier Blackjack Weir, he is more than happy to run around in the fringes of Phuoc Tuy away from population areas chasing main force units.
Yeah, okay.
He sees that as the proper role of 1 ATF. His successor, Brigadier Henderson, goes back to population-centric counter-insurgency.
Yeah.
Henderson's successor, MacDonald, he goes back to chasing, well, not even chasing, he has some major contacts with big North Vietnamese regiments.
So the strategy was to change their strategy every rotation.
Yeah,
and
I mean, there's valid reasons for both of them, and there's external factors.
And it's how each of the individual commanders saw their role in the pacification at the different times of their.
Yeah, and it's the Australian commanders tend to talk about the problem in the same way. It's just where 1 ATF fits in the overall solution tends to change.
Now you mentioned your book, Destroy and Build.
Yep.
Which is about the pacification in Phuoc Tuy province from 1966 to 1972. It seems like this book covers a lot of topics from the Vietnam War that's actually pretty relevant to contemporary days. Am I drawing a long bow here, or is it something that we can look to history to help us in the future? As a historian, I know what you'll say.
Well, I mean, you've got to walk a fine line, don't you?
Yeah.
History obviously is of utility to military organisations as a way of learning, but I think you have to understand Vietnam in its own context.
Yep.
John Gentile, who I think a now retired colonel from the US Army, he wrote pretty strongly on this a few years ago, saying we're in danger of essentially cherry-picking lessons from Vietnam to justify modern debates on counterinsurgency that were happening at the time around Iraq and Afghanistan. So yeah, I think Vietnam has to be understood in its own context. Having said that, anytime you sit down as a historian of Vietnam in a lecture or you read a book about Iraq and Afghanistan and modern counterinsurgency more broadly, and you do just sit there and think, as they say, oh, we had this problem, we had this problem, we had this problem, you do sit there and think, yeah, Vietnam, Vietnam, and that ranges from incredibly low-level tactical stuff like, the enemy has RPGs and we don't have an equivalent of that, and that poses a tactical problem for us, to much bigger strategic ones. How do you, if your political objective is accomplished simply by deploying a force, how do you then translate that into operational and tactical objectives against the competing political imperative of not taking excessive casualties? Yeah. So, obviously, that was a big concern in Iraq and Afghanistan, and it was a concern. It did play on the mind of Australian commanders to an extent in Vietnam.
In Vietnam as well. So it's very interesting because people often use the character of the Vietnam War and juxtapose it with the character of the wars that have been going on for the past 15 or so years. Probably 17 now, it just shows how old I'm getting. But it's interesting understanding the character of particular wars and yeah, I think it was Mark Twain that said history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. Yeah. Maybe the characters are similar, but that doesn't mean they're the same. And as we talked about Malaya before, one of our previous guests, Tom McDermott, brilliant bloke when it comes to pretty much everything, but particularly ethics. And he does a good job of reminding us that when you cherry pick evidence, you may be barking up the wrong tree, because if we looked at Malaya, we probably wouldn't want to fight a counterinsurgency in Iraq or Afghanistan the same way.
Well, we wouldn't be allowed, right?
We wouldn't be allowed. The political constraints placed upon a force has a large impact. Now, Tom, I have a final question for you. Everyone gets this final question. Why? Not because I'm bored of Vietnam, because I find Vietnam to be fascinating. I've just spent the past 3 weeks studying it, but because we have a mission on the show, much like Westmoreland had a mission, much like Abrams had a mission. And unlike Pierce and unlike Weir, I'm not changing the mission of the show. We try and define war in as many ways as possible because Big Carl, the dead Prussian himself, wanted us to think about war. He didn't tell us what to think, he just wanted us to do some thinking. So I'm going to ask you to finish the sentence, war is.
Wins against replacement.
War wins against replacement.
Yeah, that's what war stands for. It's an advanced baseball statistic.
Brilliant. War wins against replacement. That's excellent.
That's my shout out to Dr. Reese Crawley. Reese, I know you're listening.
Hey, he hasn't bought any,
huge baseball fan.
He hasn't bought any underwear from our merchandise line, and he's the one who asked for them.
War is. I'm struck by a remark Lawrence Freeman has made recently. The great Lawrence Freeman.
Has been booked in to come on the show. We're just working out schedules.
You're kidding.
No, I booked him in last year. We just can't line up schedules, which probably means he's dodging me. But I'll get you, Lawrence. Sir Lawrence, I'll get you.
Yes, Sir Lawrence. Oh, jeez. The way wars tend to get out of hand, and rarely work out as they were intended. Vietnam is interesting, I suppose, in the sense that it starts off as an attempt by the Communist Party of Vietnam to reunite North and South Vietnam, and they eventually succeed 15 years later. But I think as a scholar of Vietnam, we can perhaps exaggerate the extent to which they controlled that process, and we should be cognizant of, lucky is a strong word, but whether or not they benefited from certain bits of good fortune.
And time was on their side.
Time was on their side, and there tends to be a certainly even in older works of literature, this view that they are sort of everything that happens they have intended to happen, and that they're just incredibly clever, cunning guys.
It's good public relations.
Yeah, and the more scholarship emerges, particularly books like Hanoi's War and even Misalliance, it becomes more and more apparent that actually, often they were making as many blunders as we thought we were making. And I guess tying it back to our discussion of Iraq and Afghanistan, I think we've got to be wary of making the same mistakes. The assumption that your enemy is infallible, as opposed to just essentially getting lucky in the chaos of war, is one we shouldn't make. So
I'm going to tie you to the question. I have to hold you to an answer. War is getting out of hand. Is that what we're going for?
War is getting out of hand. That doesn't
sound well.
It doesn't actually sound right, does it at all? What's a better way to formulate that? War is a policy option that rarely achieves its outcomes.
That's tweetable. Tweetable. That's good. I actually like that because it's got policy in there, and the only quote people ever seem to know from Big Carl is the one about war being policy. Look, Tom, thank you very much for coming on the show. Thank you very much for just letting me in the door. It's really cold outside, and this room is quite warm.
Anytime you need shelter, Mick, we're here for you.
Excellent. I just have to bring my microphones. Look, ladies and gents, please follow Tom on Twitter. It's at TEVANRICH. Yep, confusing, but that's okay. Please look out for Tom's book. It's published by Cambridge University Press.
I've got a family to feed, guys. Thanks.
It's called Destroy and Build, Pacification in Phuoc Tuy province.
You can actually have that copy, Mick.
That's brilliant.
You can just send me some of those dead Prussian undies.
Yeah, I'll send you some of the Reese Crawley specials. Thank you very much for the book. I always enjoy a guest who gives me their book. All the previous guests should take note. And also, Tom works on the Official History Project site for the Australian Defence, for Australia's involvement in Afghanistan, Iraq, and
East Timor
East Timor,
in effect, through to the final deployments of the International Stabilisation Force in 2012.
Excellent. So if you are a listener who has been involved in any of those operations from the Australian point of view, please check out the Official History Project at the Australian War Memorial and come down and give them some material.
And if you are someone who's got in contact with us on the database, thank you very much. We are chasing you all up if you haven't heard from us yet.
Excellent. All right, well, ladies and gentlemen, that's all I've got for today, and I've just been given a book, so I suggest you grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at The Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.